President Trump announces a new class of battleship for the United States Navy, starting with the USS Defiant, which the Pentagon is calling the most lethal warship ever to be built.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague on the editorial page, editorial board member Kate Odell. Christmas comes early for the United States Navy as President Trump on Monday joined Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Navy Secretary John Phelan to announce a new Trump class of American battleship. A fact sheet from the Pentagon says this class may include anywhere from 20 to 25 ships eventually, each roughly 850 feet long, with a crew of 650 to 850, and mounted with such armaments as surface-launched cruise missiles, railguns, ram launchers, lasers. Let's listen to President Trump at this announcement on Monday.
As Commander-in-Chief, it is my great honor to announce that I have approved a plan for the Navy to begin the construction of two brand new, very large, the largest we've ever built, battleships. You know, you used to build the Iowa, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, the Alabama, many others. We had big battleships. These are bigger, but they will have 100 times they'll be 100 times the force, the power, and there's never been anything like these ships. These have been under design consideration for a long time, and it started with me in my first term, because I said, why aren't we doing battleships like we used to? And these are the best in the world. They'll be the fastest, the biggest, and by far 100 times more powerful than any battleship ever built.
And here is Navy Secretary John Phelan.
The future Trump-class battleship, the USS Defiant, will be the largest, deadliest, and most versatile and best-looking warship anywhere on the world's oceans. I want to thank the President for his vision to make this game-changing capability for the United States Navy.
Kate, what do you make of the armaments, the specs on this ship, and what about this idea in theory? I mean, to answer the president's question there, my layman's recollection of naval history is why don't we do battleships anymore was the advent of the aircraft carrier came along.
Well, Kyle, I think before talking about the specifics of the battleship, it's worth putting this in a larger context, which is U.S. naval power is in rough shape right now. The U.S. Navy has about 295 ships, and it's really been stuck at that level for years. The last time the battle force had a 3 in front of it was 2002. And that's because we are retiring ships faster than we purchase them. And meantime, so we're really living off of Ronald Reagan's naval buildup from the 1980s still, even now. And in the meantime, the United States has really an unprecedented naval threat from the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP is undertaking just an enormous military buildup. They are minting all sorts of different types of ships. They are the world's largest Navy now by ship count, even though the U.S. Navy has more tonnage and displacement. And the Chinese Communist Party is also building a rocket force of long-range missiles that they want to point directly at U.S. ships to keep the United States out of the Western Pacific, to keep us from intervening in a conflict for, say, control of Taiwan. This is an enormous problem. It is really one of the most consequential security questions for the United States in 2026. So at a high level, I am heartened to see Trump giving some attention to the decline of U.S. naval power. That is an example of something that would not have happened if Harris had won the election. So I think you have to start with that bigger picture that we do have a president who is at some level interested in renewing U.S. naval power. Now, if you want to talk about the specifics of the battleship, it's getting immediately dismissed in the headlines. So, Trump named it after himself. We don't need a big vulnerable ship. I think that is unfair. I think the concept has some merit. If you are going to plan around deterring the Chinese Navy for reasons I just described, you need a lot of long-range missile firepower. And currently, the U.S. Navy doesn't have enough of it. So if you look at the ship and its capacity to carry long-range weapons, I think it has some merit. It also will perhaps be helpful in providing more cover for U.S. aircraft carriers that are vulnerable in the Pacific. It also, my last note about what's on it and why this is both interesting and important is it hasn't gotten nearly any attention, but the ship, Trump says, will carry a tactical nuclear weapon called the Sea-Launched Nuclear Cruise Missile. This is a weapon that has been under development for a while, but the Biden administration tried to cancel it. But what it really does is kind of reassure our allies in Europe and South Korea that we are going to deploy a tactical nuclear weapon, and the U.S. nuclear umbrella extended deterrence will hold. And so those things that I go through real quick, I mean, I think at a large level, you've at least got a president who cares about the decline of U.S. naval power, and you've got a ship that has some merit for the Western Pacific and is directionally a good sign toward reassuring our allies that we are interested in defending our interests there. But that might preclude some larger reservations I have that you can ask me about.
What about the capacity of the U.S. to get this kind of ship built and into the water in a good time in order to deter the kind of conflict maybe around Taiwan that you're talking about? Because it's one thing to roll out a fancy press release with some nice diagrams and a list of specifications about lasers and railguns and all these high-tech things that are going to be on this ship. And it's another thing to actually get the steel bent and welded and put together in such a way that the ship can actually get in the water and become operational.
That's the real question here: is can the United States get these ships in the water in any reasonable time frame, and what priorities will it detract from in the meantime as we try to do that? One thing to walk you through is that the Trump administration recently washed its hands of a frigate program that the Navy was trying to build, a relatively simple warship, not a sophisticated aircraft carrier with a bunch of new tech that tends to be very, very challenging to build. This was a relatively basic warship that the Navy was trying to build. The warship exists in European navies, so there are fleets where it's already driving around. So the goal was, let's copy and paste the ship so that we can work on expanding our fleet, free up other ships for higher end missions. And it became just a complete debacle. It's called the Constellation class frigate. And the reason it became a complete debacle is because the Navy's acquisition bureaucracy basically imposed all of these changes on the design of the ship. So it started out 85% similar to this European ship and that we wanted to copy and paste, and it ended up being closer to 15%. And the civilian leadership under President Biden really just did not pose any sort of discipline on this program. And there's always a reason for these changes. The acquisition bureaucracy would say, we need the ship to be survivable, so we are making it conform to our standards for that. But the result is that we don't have the ships. We're going to finish 2 of these ships under constructions, and a ship that doesn't exist is not survivable. So the frigate turned into this enormous debacle. The first ship was running 3 years late, and the Trump administration canceled it. And in addition to this new battleship that they're talking about, the Trump administration is also going to build a Coast Guard cutter and kind of retrofit it for U.S. Navy purposes to try to meet the lower end mission set that the Navy needs to be able to, patrol the rest of the world, to deter bad actors and lower end threats. And the question is whether we can even get any of those in the water in a reasonable time frame. And they're taking some risk by selecting this Coast Guard ship that doesn't currently have missile cells on it like the Navy will need. And I go through all of that because I think it really does bring to the central question, which is the battleship and are these national security cutters, are they part of a larger strategy? Are they what we should be building right now if we really think the Chinese Communist Party is a near-term threat and not a long-term threat? And one of my core concerns is that it might detract us from building more stealthy submarines, which Trump also talked about. And I can go into more detail on that if you want. But the question is really, is this the best use of our money if Trump is not serious about rebuilding, about expanding the defense budget, which he does not appear to be?
Well, are you suggesting that there are some strategic ambiguities or strategic muddles maybe at work here? I mean, it seems like sometimes the Trump administration talks in its recent national security strategy, for example, about prioritizing the Western Hemisphere. We have a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. At times, it suggests that allies abroad need to pick up the slack, and the United States might be stepping back from Europe and stepping back from Asia. And then you have an announcement like this, where there is a new battleship that the Pentagon and President Trump are saying are going to maintain America's naval superiority. So what are the threads that connect all of these elements of the Trump policy that we see on the ground?
I think that lack of strategic clarity is perhaps the strongest criticism of the direction we're going in. A shipbuilding podcast that I listened to interviewed one of Trump's old Navy secretaries. There were many of them the other day, Tom Maudley, and he was talking about how everything that went wrong with the frigate I was just talking about, the strategic disaster that was the frigate, is really downstream from the fact that we're not clear on what we want the United States Navy to be able to do. And that's downstream of the fact that we're not really clear on what the United States should be doing as a nation. And so I do think there is a problem that the strategy that the ships that we're building are not flowing directly down from a larger strategy. And I'll give you, an example of that, which is that the Trump administration talks a lot about Ronald Reagan's sprint to a 600-ship Navy in the 1980s. That was the last major recapitalization of U.S. naval power that the United States did. And the Trump administration, I think, sees themselves in that legacy and wants to have something similar that they can claim. But that buildup, the Reagan buildup, started with a theory of the case that, one, the United States was a global power with global interests, but it did know exactly who its biggest adversary was, in that case, the Soviet Union, and now the Chinese Communist Party. And from that, the Reagan buildup also included years and years of sustained increases in defense spending so that we could build the military power that we needed to defeat that main adversary in a war if we came down to it. And then from there, we used that expanded naval fleet and exercised it to show that we were willing to use it if we needed to use it. And that, I think, is the cocktail behind winning the Cold War. And so right now we have some ideas for ships that Trump likes, battleships, and then these lower end, Jeffersonian gunboats, almost cutters. But it's not really rooted in the theory of who the United States might need to fight and what it would use to do so. And so we're all waiting for the National Defense Strategy to come out, which is it's an under document to that national security strategy you mentioned that says, okay, here are the forces that we need to build to implement our larger national security strategy. But if you don't know who your main threat is, you're not going to build the right naval fleet for the moment. And I think that gets into some of the larger problems here.
You mentioned the defense spending angle, and am I right that the president's budget proposal for 2026 includes a cut after inflation to the Pentagon's budget? And it's true that there was some one-time money in the One Big Beautiful Bill, but we are not meeting the NATO target for the new NATO target for 5% of spending on defense, right? And President Trump has made a huge push to get those allies to increase that target. Where is the American leadership on getting there ourselves?
If you want a larger Navy, given the just depths of the dysfunction we have and how long it's been since we really recapitalized the U.S. Navy, you have to increase the defense budget. And that's not necessarily popular in either party at the current moment. I mean, the height of the Reagan buildup, the U.S. spent about 6% of its economy on the military. Right now, we're at about 3%. And this figure gets attacked a lot as well. We just got a lot richer, and so now we can spend a lot less. But if you look at the trend line, I mean, we spent less in the Cold War than we did in Vietnam or Korea. It has gone down. But I think it's impossible to argue that you can have a military that's larger and more capable and filled with unmanned vehicles to complement our forces and, respond to the way warfare changes at the current level of effort of budget, which is much lower than even what we spent during the years we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not credible. The defense budget will have to go up. And that's why I think the president here did not propose, exactly, here's the money we're going to spend to make sure these battleships are a reality and that they can be west of the international date line. The Trump administration has been trying to have it both ways and satisfy some fiscal pockets in its coalition, but while also claiming to rebuild the military. And that's led to this frenetic account where they fund a lot of the defense budget in that one-time reconciliation bill. And a lot of the shipbuilding account specifically is, cut almost in half in that reconciliation bill, half in the base budget. If you want, more shipbuilding in the United States, if you want more companies to enter that space and build ships for the United States, you have to put a consistent signal that the money is going to be there. Shipbuilding is an incredibly capital intensive industry. It has a major labor shortage. Part of the problem, part of the reason for our shipbuilding doom loop that we talk about all the time is that the government starts ordering these ships, then just like the Constellation class frigate, it says, nope, no thanks, we'll go in a different direction. There's just been a lot of yanking around of the industrial base. And so you would need a sustained budget increase year over year that's in the base budget, that's not hostage to congressional gimmicks, if you really want to make good on making the U.S. a larger and more capable naval power.
What do you make, finally, Kate, of the Trump class, the name of this ship? I mean, it's not unprecedented to have naval boats or even classes of ships named after political leaders. We have the Gerald Ford class of aircraft carrier right now. On the other hand, Gerald Ford served in the United States Navy, and this class was not announced and named that under President Gerald Ford and by President Gerald Ford. There's also a mock-up of this first ship, the USS Defiant, released by the Navy, and it shows the Defiant plowing through some pretty stormy seas, shooting off a missile and shooting its guns and shooting off a laser, it looks like, with a pretty good-sized logo of President Trump standing in front of an American flag on the back of the ship. I'm not sure if they're really going to put that on the boat, but do you suppose that some of the admirals are kind of rolling their eyes at all of this as President Trump gets up and announces the Golden Fleet? Because, of course, everything with President Trump is always golden.
The sniping at President Trump, oh, he's so vain, he named ships after himself. It bores me a little bit, because I think the larger question is whether we get the ships in the water, and that would be helpful if we did. I think on the naming conventions, perhaps the real missed opportunity. I mean, surely some patriot inside the defense organization thought about this. Perhaps what we should have done is renamed the Virginia class attack submarines that are stealthy and present huge advantages over China. Perhaps we should have renamed those the Trump class submarines if it would get more presidential leadership and attention on building those hulls. Right now, the U.S. is building 1.1 submarine a year, 1.2. We need to get to at least 2 and possibly even 3 to have enough submarines for us, and also sell some to the Australians who we've agreed to sell some to. I mean, that to me is really the first organizing function that we should be taking around preparing for the threat against China. And President Trump did say that in this announcement. He said he called them super duper subs and heralded that we are, a decade ahead of the Chinese in stealth submarine technology. I mean, it really is a crown jewel of the fleet that we are able to hide anywhere in the world and make the Chinese Navy not sure where to expect us. So I think on the naming convention, I would have liked to see the Trump class submarines, I say with a little bit of tongue in cheek. But on the larger point about, should he have named these ships after himself, I have long thought that ship names do matter. They matter to the people who serve on the ship, but they also matter in helping the public understand why the United States needs a Navy. The former chair of the House China Committee, Mike Gallagher, actually gave a good speech about this several years ago, about how the United States Navy, when it built ballistic missile submarines, named each one after a great American and called them the ships the 41 for freedom. And it was part of communicating to the public why the United States in a hurry really needed a subs with the ability to launch nuclear weapons. And so I don't think the naming issue is trifle. And I think it is a missed opportunity to name them the Trump class, not because you can't name a ship after Trump, but because this battleship is going to take a long time to design. If we're ever going to get to 20 or 25, like Trump said, you would like to have some kind of national buy-in to these ships. You would like to not give the next Democratic president just a huge temptation to just hit cancel on the ships and waste a bunch of energy and time around building these ships. So I do think the naming conventions are important, but I think the higher priority is really whether can Trump succeed at putting any of these cutters, even 2 battleships in the water? Can he start to turn around the decline of U.S. naval power and produce a better picture during this very tense moment in the Pacific, especially during the next few years? There's going to be another election in Taiwan where China could use that as a pretense to provoke a crisis. It really is the defining window in the next 5 or 6 years about peace in the Western Pacific. And so I think that has to be the animating focus as we look at the battleship announcement.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us your own suggested ship names at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back later this week with another edition of Potomac Watch.